The dawn of civilization. Primitive. Dangerous. Exciting. The handwriting is on the wall. If the human race is ever going to amount to anything, it needs
the most civilized caveman I have ever seen.
Look who's come out of his cave.
So for this episode of the Cave Dweller Music Podcast, I've got two guys who are pretty renowned in the Melbourne metal scene. I've got Kene from Burning Bitumen radio show on PBSFM in Melbourne, and I've got Wayne Donovan from about 13 bands. Goes to pretty much every show in Melbourne and hosts his own radio show as well, Infernal Noize Radio. Hey guys, how you doing?
Good. Good.
Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate that everyone's pretty busy at the moment, and Wayne's actually on his way to another gig. So, surprise, surprise.
Another day, another gig. You know how it is.
So you're quite notorious for going to just about every gig there is in town, Wayne.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like I guess my main hobby. So you know, got there what you got to do.
Well, you're lucky enough to live in a city that's got an absolute abundance of live music, and especially good quality heavy music, which is what we're all about here at Cave Dweller.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So we might start with a bit of background on you guys. You both have radio shows, you both love metal, and you both live in Melbourne. So do you want to start, Kene, and just give us a bit of a rundown on how you got into radio and, yeah, basically why you devote your time to this scene?
Basically, I got into radio because I was at a party with a friend who was already on PBS and was having a few drinks, and I was just talking about music way too much. And he said, you should come and put in a demo and talk about this on air rather than boring him, I think, at the party. But that was the main thing. But I've always been a fan of community radio in Melbourne and listened to a lot of different stuff. And I started a show. That was in about 2001. It was a bit different in PBS in those days. We were in St Kilda, and I recorded the demo in the studio that wouldn't go to air. And it was like the studio was just like, I don't know, it was like a dodgy share house almost, and which is a lot different to what PBS is now. And I just started the show and sort of sorted my way out early days with all the sort of heavy genres, but moved into sort of the more extreme metal in the sort of later sort of 2000s. And it's been like that ever since.
And were you playing music at all, or you're just a fan?
No, I've always been I was sort of done the DJ thing, really. Like before I got a show, I would, did DJs at parties and had my own sort of business for a while doing that. I've always done that. I've always been a music fan. I've always, I don't know, never got off my ass to put together my own musical stuff. Always playing other people's music. That's what I've always done.
And over to you, Wayne. How did you manage to get into the scene and into radio and into the all the bands that you're in?
Yeah, I guess so. It started back when I was in high school. I was actually pretty late compared to most people in terms of when I started getting into music. But met a friend at high school who had a cousin that was doing a radio show in the southeastern suburbs, and so I started listening to that every week, and I'm just hearing all this like grindcore and black metal, death metal, sludge, doom, all this stuff that I'd never really heard. I guess I was still at the real early stages of heavy music at that point. And at one point, I'd listen to that pretty religiously, and I started taping it as well because I was like, "Oh, this is cool. I'll just listen to it again." And then, my friend said, you can come in. We can come in as like a guest and just see it in person." I'm like, "Oh, that's cool." And wouldn't have said much on air at that point in time, but I was like, "Oh, this is really cool." And then started just like gradually going in a bit more and more. And Mike, the host of that, would always give me recommendations. So I'd go and look this band up, and if I could find a CD pretty cheap, I'd just buy it and start playing it. And eventually I just became a regular guest. And then at one point, and I'd often bring a lot of music to play. And then at one point he had to go overseas for a while, and he was like, "Oh, would you be able to fill in for a few weeks?" And just from there, just became a co-host. And over time, I've become sort of, I guess, not necessarily the main host, but just the more frequent, because he lived a lot further away, a lot of work commitments, so it was often hard for him to get there. But the shows, we're in our 31st year now as a show. I haven't been involved for that long. I've been nearly 20 or something like that, so it's still not a bad innings, I think. But yeah, and that just sort of opened me up to a whole lot of things. And then fast forward quite a few more years after that, and a friend that I'd met at a house party one night, we sort of bonded over just liking a lot of alternative and metal and stuff. And for years we kept talking like, oh, we should start a band, but none of us were musicians really. And then eventually we just did it, and like did a noise project called Colostomy Baguette. And yeah, like we used to jam. That's now just a completely improvised thing really. But for a while we were like, practicing and trying to just make what we thought was cool shit. And what happened next? From there, there used to be this sludge band called She Beast that were playing in Melbourne a bit. Spoke to their guitarist and vocalist quite at length at a few shows, and he eventually asked us to play a show with him, with his band, and then did a split release. And then eventually he said, oh, just come and jam with us. We'll see what we can do. And that was the birth of Religious Observance. So that worked out pretty good. And then a couple of years later, same guy, Ben, he suggested, let's do another band that's still a bit sludgy, just not as full on. And we started Creep Diets. And yeah, so that's sort of how I got into bands, and briefly was in Rawhead for a while as well, which is like a bit shifted gore grind thing. I kind of had no idea what I was doing. I had fun, but yeah, I guess it just, and I think they might have almost completely stopped now as well. But yeah, and then most recently did an improvised jam with Muddy Lawrence, which is Reese from Diploid, doing a noise thing, and just one day put the feelers out for people to collaborate live for an improvised set. And yeah, I was one of them, and it looks like that's happening again soon. So
awesome.
Yeah.
So you're not only going to all the gigs, you're involved in a fair percentage of them yourself.
Yeah, and I think it's like, again, I don't have that many hobbies, I guess, and like all I want to do is be at gigs or performing. And I think my, Religious Observance and Creep Diets are probably getting sick of me trying to get more shows. So trying to find another project so I can not annoy people too much, but still be doing stuff all the time. So
yeah. And you're known around town, like I said earlier, for, if you go to a show, there's a fair chance that Wayne's going to be there, especially if it's a heavy show. And, I've found myself recently going to shows and I'll take a photo of the band and then, oh, Wayne's in the photo, Is that, that's obviously grown from your love of music, but is that something that you also do to just be providing yourself with content for your radio show as well? And I guess the same for you as well, Kane. Are you getting out to see heaps of shows just to not only because you love it, but just to keep the show going?
Yeah, it's a bit like that, but I just really enjoy seeing bands. Like, I think as a whole, I've always seen a whole lot of bands in my what I do. It's made it easier being at PBS because if a lot of bands help me out and labels help me out to go to see the shows, and you get a lot of support from people that you've helped out. Wayne being a good example. He's in two pretty awesome bands that I like to see. I think it's just part of it. It's just part of the culture. I'm lucky I've got a partner who also likes to go and see shows as well. So I see a lot of different things outside of the heavy realm as well as shows within the heavy realm. I'll basically go and see anything that's happening if I'm available, whether it's, not outside of that, the heavy stuff, hip hop or country or whatever. So it's not just seeing the heavy scene. I think it gives you a better idea of when you do go and see a heavy band, how good they are really, how spoilt we are.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of the same for me as well. Like I remember years ago, there was at one point where I any band I see, I'm like, I want to buy everything they've got and play it and stuff. And like, as I've gotten older and a bit fussier, I guess, with what I like to listen to, and that one's made of money, I guess, as well. But also, my show's an hour a week, and I've got so much stuff that I've picked up over the years that like it's a little bit hard to like keep purposely just trying to find more for that. But it definitely helps with finding new stuff to play. But I also still just generally love seeing stuff I haven't seen before. Love going to venues I haven't been before. It's all like Jenny said, like it's good to see something outside of a heavy throw as well. Just get to see what the other scenes are like, and it's often it's really rewarding.
How what are the big things that you guys notice then when you're going to those shows that aren't in your normal sort of wheelhouse? Do you feel, obviously, when you go to like an extreme metal show, there's a lot more participation from the crowd, and but what are the other sort of main things that you notice between the different scenes?
The really big thing in the heavy scene, particularly the metal scene, is it's a lot less aggro in the crowds. The crowds are quite well behaved. A lot of people sort of expect the heavy stuff to be like really rough and like aggressive, and it's apart from the front watching the bands where people are having fun doing that, the crowd's usually pretty polite, pretty well behaved. And you go to a lot of these gigs, like I've been to some, particularly like some of the sort of bigger named acts, and people are just dicks. Like they really can be, and that's the big difference. I reckon that's the real big difference.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and especially once you get to that bigger sort of, as you said, the bigger sort of bands, bigger name for themselves and the bigger following, and often it will be at larger venues. And I feel like when you get to that stage, you get a lot of people that don't go to shows much. So I think like it's their excuse for, oh, this is my time of the year to just go crazy and not think about anyone else and just end up being a pain.
Yeah. I've always found myself, I do like to go and watch heavy bands, but the bands that I've played in the past have kind of been on the edge of the heavy scenes. You could occasionally get away with doing a show in the heavy scene, but I've always found sort of like swinging into, I guess, the more indie rock and alternative rock scenes, people just take themselves way too seriously. And it seems to be, from my experience, that in the metal scene in Melbourne, it's almost like everybody's just there to have a good time. Like the bands are super talented. The people take what they're doing on stage seriously, but the second they put their guitar down, everybody's just friendly and happy. And I guess you guys must notice that as well.
Yeah, it's kind of almost like a sort of network. Most of the time you can go to a show without knowing anyone else going at the time, but when you get there, you're going to run into a whole lot of people you do know without sort of organising it, without doing it. It's like everyone gets on well. It's pretty friendly. Most people will talk to you and say hello and say hi if they know you, or even if they don't, but not in a, it's like, because you're there to see that sort of music, everyone's sort of bonded already. Everyone's like made a choice. They're not there to say, oh, I went to this show, or I went to this show. It's not that. They're just there to see the music.
I guess one of the other things too, and you'd know this probably better than anyone, Wayne, is the bands all start to definitely get on with each other, make friendships. The circles that you travel in, Wayne, there's that many different bands that are always playing together and sharing members, and is that one of the things that you've found is pretty unique to the metal scene?
I guess I don't know specifically how unique it is, but because I've only ever been involved in the heavier scene as far as participating in bands, but it's definitely a thing where being with a great musician, like having a great musician in your band is great, and it is important. But I think like if the people you're with are good to be around, that'll make the band, you might not succeed among the masses or anything like that, but if you're able to have a good time, hang out with that person, do what you're doing, and enjoy the time with them, it has more clout than musical ability, in my opinion, anyway.
So getting back to the radio side of things, obviously a big part of what we do at Cave Dweller is sitting down and interviewing people. You guys have probably done a hell of a lot more of that than I have. I'm fairly new to the game. So what have been highlights over the years for you, Kene? People that you've interviewed, or just things that you've learned over the years from, sitting down and chatting to artists from all over the world?
Highlights is hard. I've interviewed most bands in the sort of metal genre that you could think of, from Slayer and to Megadeth in the sort of thrash scene, to like just so many people. Highlights is hard. I think more like interesting interviews, probably like, I think I always remember the worst ones. Like I interviewed Glenn Danzig, and it was on the phone, which was lucky because I think I would have punched him if it was face to face, because he was just a complete dick. And it was hard to describe. He was like a 14-year-old boy. He's just really argumentative and like sort of trying to one up during the interview. And I'm just trying to talk to him. Like that sort of thing is hard. I think of recent years, particularly in the last sort of, because I've been doing my show for about 22 years, last sort of 5 to 10 years, I've really enjoyed talking to the local bands, particularly Melbourne bands. I think I get a lot more out of that. Like it's sort of becoming a highlight because I sort of, where they're coming from, but also I like to not only talk to them, but I like to promote the local scene when I can, in combination with the international scene. I think it's just to get people to listen to these bands that I think are some of the best in the world. So, over the last couple of years, I really, really enjoyed, especially during lockdown, talking to local bands and seeing what they're at, even though they weren't up to much, is just seeing what was going to happen into the future. And I think that, to me, has been probably a highlight of the last few years, as much as, I could go through a whole list of hundreds of known bands that I've talked to, but the highlights are probably talking to people who ended up being someone who, like we've said before, who I go and see a show and I'm actually like, hey, how are you going? And you have something that you can talk about, and they're actually good people, and meeting how good the people are in the Melbourne scene. It's really, that's sort of more important to me than trying to tick boxes off the list.
I guess one of the nice things that you probably find with interviewing local bands as well, and this is something I'm learning myself, is that, when people are at that earlier stage of their journey, they're hungry to talk about what they're doing. So it usually makes for a much better interview. You're not, a bigger artist might think that you're there to try and boost your profile, and, they've already done everything. Whereas a local band, they appreciate the coverage, I guess.
Yeah, no, like, to be honest, a lot of the internationals that I talk to now, I tend to sort of focus on smaller acts anyway, like probably big enough to tour here, but not like playing more like the Bendigo or something smaller, not, stadium acts. I don't really search that out anymore. I've done that. I'm interested in the kind of the music that I like to talk about isn't really on the big stage.
Yeah.
And also a lot of people like Wayne is, he's been in the scene for a long time. When I interview people like that, they've got a lot to say. It's interesting. It's not about always new people. And everyone's pretty supportive when you say they're going to be on the radio, to be honest, when you talk to them. Doesn't matter who they are. The bigger people actually are more happy that, especially in metal, that you're actually going to talk about them. So, it's pretty much even. It's just more interesting hearing about people from your own town, I think.
And have you had many opportunities to do interviews and that sort of stuff in the 20 years that you've been doing, Wayne, or is it a bit tight with the hour show?
Yeah, no, we've definitely done plenty of interviews. I've sort of quietened off, since COVID, really. The way that the studio operated made it a little more difficult, and I don't even have a computer at home, so it made it harder for me to get stuff recorded and then able to air. We've got a workaround now, so I should probably start doing a bit more, but kind of thinking the same, where a lot of the local ones are a bit more rewarding, I guess. And I don't think my show has a huge listenership, but also like when I'll talk to someone occasionally, they'll be like, "Oh, I heard this band that you interviewed or whatever," and I'm like, "Oh, they're cool, I love it," and I'm like, "That's exactly what I want." I just want to support that community that we're part of, and so that's super rewarding. My all-time favorite interview, it was so good. It was Mike Williams from I Hate God, and it was just one of the most enjoyable interviews because I had a list of questions that my co-host and I had come up with, and at that point in time, he knew them a lot more than I did, so he had a lot more in-depth questions. And like, I don't think I even finished it because every answer was just so talkative and it was such a pleasing conversation. Like, it felt like I was talking to someone I'd known for years. So it was just talkative and really appreciative as well. And like, the funny thing is, at that point in time, I barely knew the band. I've now since, gone and got them. I've followed them around Southeast Asia. I've got them tattooed on me. So they're like, they're pretty important to me now. But at that point in time, I hardly knew a thing. And I remember hanging up the phone thinking that was the best interview I've ever done. And then I was so gutted to find out that the recording app on my phone didn't work.
Oh, shit.
So the whole thing was just gone. I was like, I could have cried. It was, that wasn't fun.
Oh, well, at least you got to have that conversation. And I guess
exactly
that sparked something inside you that's, created a lifelong love for the band.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Yeah, definitely.
So before we jumped on and started recording, Ken, you were discussing there's been a bit of a shift recently in the scene in Melbourne. Obviously, we had a pretty interesting time here over the last couple of years with the lockdowns. I think we spent, one of the longer amounts of time in lockdown of anywhere in the world. And the music scene took a massive hit due to that. But things are starting to definitely get back to a healthy point now. But you were saying that there's a bit of a shift in the focus of the metal scene in Melbourne.
Yeah, I think so. Like, definitely out of lockdown. And it was happening a little bit before, but there's been a lot more support for death metal in the Melbourne scene, in the heavy scene. A lot more death metal shows, but also really solid bands in that genre, which there probably wasn't in Melbourne previous to that for a while. Like, there was a few bands happening, but it's like there's so many amazing death metal bands, and it sort of come out of a real black metal heavy stage as far as extreme stuff's concerned. We've always had the sort of noise scene and that on the side, which is kind of like always bubbling over. It's sort of a very creative kind of art scene, but it's the other genres seem to take it in turns to be what everybody's listening to, and it's definitely death metal at the moment, which is great because you've got bands like Faceless Burial and Gutless and Carcinoid and Hormagaunt and 100 Years War, and then there's some old bands that are sort of revising, like a Bremelin and stuff like that. It's just really exciting. There's so many more. I just can't think of them all right now. Probably should have written a list, but I think it's really exciting to be part of it because you go to these gigs that sell out well before the shows happen, and you get there and it's just a crowd of packed, and there's a whole lot of people that you haven't seen at metal shows before because it's kind of like it's getting a bit of a name for itself and people are coming to them, and it's really exciting. But I think there's a change probably coming in the next bit. Like, it always moves around. I think there's a bit of a sort of move towards, I think the sludge thing is due for a revival, and I think that's coming. But it's really interesting to go to these shows where probably I've had some conversations with some people in these bands who were saying, those shows that was sort of before lockdown where there'd be 12 people in the room, and now they come and they can't get their friends on because the show sold out 2 to 3 months ago, and there's no tickets left on the night. So it's really interesting, and if you're a fan of heavy music, it's just like a really good time to get out and see some local stuff, because I've seen a lot of these local death metal bands blow internationals off the stage. Like, I won't mention the international bands that I've seen, but it's like you watch the local bands just be so much tighter, so much better crafted songs, and just more exciting. And then this international will come on and you go, you know,
Oh, that's really great to see. And what about from your perspective, Wayne? I know that you're really deep into the sludge and the noise and the doom scene. How are you seeing that at the moment?
Yeah, it's still going pretty good. Like it's always been reasonably solid, I think. And there's a few bands dropped off throughout COVID, but then a few more started, and some that were just starting before COVID happened. So I think it's still pretty healthy. But like Kenny's definitely right. There's so much death metal and like a lot of real high quality stuff happening at the moment as well. I think for me the biggest thing is I'm feeling a bit of lack at the moment is grindcore. Like there is definitely some good bands, but I just want to rewind back to like the early 2000s when we had the likes of the Days and Became Nothing and Vaginal Carnage and Captain Clean Off and just all the time. So I guess that's where I want things to go, but I'm sure it'll happen soon. But like just heavy in general, I think is really, really healthy.
Yeah.
So many good bands and just putting on good performances. I'm loving it.
Do you think things will change a bit now? I mean, obviously for the last year at least, with things opening back up, the spotlight's really been shone on the local artists because that was what was available. Do you think people will sort of keep that up, or do you think people will sort of start to gravitate back towards international bands? Or, I mean, like you were saying, Ken, you're seeing now that the local bands are starting to sort of wipe the floor with some of the touring bands. But is there a bit of an inkling that it might go back to how things were before?
I think, there's always been a support for the local stuff. I think probably will be, as always, depends on what's happening. But I think Melbourne's got the size of the population to be able to support a lot of gigs on the night. There's some nights where there'll be 6 or 7 heavy gigs on all at once, and the international ones aren't completely selling out as quick as they used to. Like, sure, there's some bands that do, but they're usually at quite small venues. I think people are sort of acknowledging that we've got some really good local stuff and going to see it over an international band. There's a couple of the bands that I spoke about that if they play and there was an international band of the same genre, unless it was a pretty important or classic band, I think that they would struggle to win over their audience. And I think that's why a lot of those bands end up on the support bill, because I've been to a few international shows where people have just turned up for the support bands and then left, which is interesting. And it reminds me of the sort of the 90s rock scene, which was revival at sort of the era with sort of the Powder Monkeys and stuff like that, where you'd go to shows there was a really high quality of heavy rock bands happening in Melbourne. I hate to sound like an old guy, but I am, so why not? That people would turn up just to see these amazing bands who were supporting international artists or interstate artists, because they're not the international artist is nowhere near as good as these local bands, and the room would clear, and the international band would be left with a third of the audience that was there for the band before them. I think it's a bit like that. I think it's going to get more like that as these bands get bigger and get better releases and better production on their releases that are already good, which is happening already.
I guess one of the other things too is the health of the venues at the moment. I mean, there was a time during COVID where it looked like a lot of the venues were going to close, and some have, some new ones have popped up. But what are you guys sort of seeing at the moment in terms of the venues? Are things still looking pretty healthy there, and are there some good new ones that have sort of opened up and surprised you a bit? Or
I think we're due for a few more heavy venues because there is crowds going to them. But there's some solid ones, like the Gasso is becoming a more solid sort of heavy venue, and there's a couple of other gigs elsewhere, sort of places like little places open playing the heavy bands as well as not just at the heavy venues. You know, like I noticed Gutless did a pizza store opening last week, and you know, there's these things that were always used to be the sort of field for an indie band, but places are going, no, we'll put on a death metal band because people want to see that. So it's interesting.
What about you, Wayne? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit hard to know because I'm like, you know, we're obviously not seeing what their books are looking like and things like that. But I feel it is healthy in the sense that, you know, I can go to all our regular venues, and even if there's no bands playing, I know there's still going to be a decent amount of people there, you know, that I can chat to, whatever. So like it looks good at the surface, but I think until you start going through those through the books, it's really hard to know for sure how they're doing. But I'm hopeful, and like I just, you know, I'll support venues where I can as well. I saw that recently. I saw something online about it might be like public liability potentially going to be increasing quite a bit in cost, which is like it pretty shit because, you know, as regulars we know that nothing happens at these heavy gigs. Yeah. Like the amount of claims they would have had to make would be absolutely minuscule, and probably most of those are all these dude bros that have been kicked out of their clubs, so they come somewhere else where they can, you know, keep partying on, and they're causing problems. And it's
we in one of our recent podcasts, we had Jem from Dead, who I know is a friend of yours, Wayne. He was talking about, you know, bands starting to make a bit of a shift back into the DIY spaces, you know, looking for alternative venues rather than playing in pubs. Is that something that you're sort of hearing a bit of or noticing at all? Like I know I saw Creep Diets play in a tiny shop space in Footscray last year.
Yeah. I and like, I don't get me wrong, I absolutely love all our venues, and they're, you know, the staff are always great people to be with, and like I want to support them, but give me the option for a DIY space and I'm all over it. I think it's just that bit more organic, and I enjoyed it. I went to a backyard, although it was like kind of in someone's shed show on the weekend, and like it's just I guess it's what Kenny was saying before about like you compare with some of the bigger rock acts and stuff like that, just the people that attend versus the local heavy shows, where you say, you know, it's a lot of people that are there like, oh, look, I'm at insert venue name here. I'm wild. And then you come to a heavy show and they're like, I just want to be here. I just want to see the band and have a few drinks with my mates. Like, it's like that, but I guess even more so because no one's going to stumble in there by mistake. They're there because they want to be there. And, you know, I love all those intimate shows as well. Like, you know, the band's playing and they're bumping into you. Like, I'm all for that. It's just like, it's just fun. Sound quality is obviously not always the best, but yeah, I love venues, I love DIY, but I think Jem is right. There is a little bit more attention going to that now, and I guess, you know, some of that's potentially due to venues having maybe a little bit stricter conditions compared to prior to COVID. So maybe, for example, there's, you know, smaller guarantees or higher fees or something like that that's not making it as viable. But the DIY space has definitely got a lot going for it in I guess just the general feel, and like, you know, they're generally all ages as well, so you can get younger people to come and see stuff that they might not have been able to see at a pub, for example.
Awesome. I think that's interesting with the Wayne talking about the all ages thing. There is such a big space in the heavy scene of younger people that can't access all these bands. So, you know, that's really, really important. So
definitely. And I know that some venues are like, the Bendigo's been like put on a lot of all ages shows over the last couple of years, which is amazing. And I just like, I think there's probably so much risk, especially like financial risk with it as well. So I get why it doesn't happen more, and that's at the, you know, due to whatever government policies and things like that, which sucks. But I guess going back to what we were talking about before about, you know, pre-COVID versus now, it was one thing that I noticed, and like maybe a little bit more in the punk rather than the heavy scene, but both scenes definitely, is I'm coming to a lot of shows after lockdown, and everyone's just chomping at the bit to go see something. So all of a sudden, these people that probably usually only came out for an international, they're just like, yep, let's just go see a heavy show. And there's so many people, I'm like, I've never seen them before in my life. This is awesome. They're young. They're probably just finished school a few months ago. Like, I love seeing all that, just new people. And I think that's probably spawned more bands as well, which what Ken was talking about before about, a bigger scene emerging. I think that's like a good fuel for that.
And also, like, it's so weird, like some of the death metal shows that have happened sort of last year, there was like influencers and stuff at the show, which is very weird for those sort of heavy genres, like people there walking around done up and taking photos of them at the gigs, which is not good, but it's also good at the same time because it just means that there's different people getting into the music because they weren't having a bad time. I have been at sort of really heavy gigs where people have thought the band was cool and then, have left because they've been frightened. But, that does happen. And, but, it's interesting that there is that sort of more accepting of the public as a whole. There's definitely a generational shift in what people listen to heavy music. I think sort of more my age bracket or older people think of heavy music, you're either into it or you're not. Yeah. And it's something that's sort of, a bit out of the way. But now it's like, it's just a mood. And I think the new generation, particularly if they feel like going to see a heavy, like a death metal band, they'll go and see that. And if they want to go to a rave on the weekend, they'll do that as well. Like that's the big change in people's tastes is you don't just have to be a metalhead to go and see a metal show or a heavy show.
And it's funny you say that because, like, with having influences there and stuff, like, there's a small part of it that's like, hey, this is our scene, but it's also like, it should be more people's scene. Like, there's just this stereotypes that, only heavy, you can't listen to heavy and whatever else. Whereas, like, realistically, there's just so much potential crossover that's just so often just ignored and that will never get approached. But I think having these influencer type people there, like, it's going to help get other people involved, and then eventually some of those people might actually start trying to make music as well, and they'll bring something else to it, the scene that doesn't exist currently. So I think it is all a good thing, even if some of the results might not appeal to me, but I think it's a good thing. Just keep it thriving, keep it growing.
I guess it's a good thing too if you've got people that are potentially there for different reasons. At least they're still there buying a ticket and putting money in the band's pocket. So
yeah, and buying
absolutely.
Buying lots of merch too.
Yes.
Now you've managed over the last couple of years to do a bit of getting around Australia with your bands, Wayne. Just a few weekenders here and there. Is that something that's been a little bit easier for bands to do with internationals not being around? I guess for local bands to sort of get to different towns and have an opportunity where there might not have been one there before?
I mean, that's potentially the case. So without the internationals, there's I don't really have a term for it, but there's a lot of people that I think of that only come out for the internationals, and it's stereotyping. I probably shouldn't do it, but I feel like a lot of those are now shifting to like, I guess now if it's an interstate, I'll come. And like it's a good thing. There's a lot of amazing bands in the world, but there's a lot of amazing bands right here on our doorstep that we should be checking out. So yeah, I think that's potentially made it a little bit easier, but it's also like, I mean, that's something I've wanted to do since forever. And I want to do international touring as well. So it's sort of like, for me personally, and I think most of my band members probably aren't too far off the mark as well. Even if I knew that was going to cost me, I doubt we made any money on that. But like, even if it was going to I was going to be completely out of pocket, I'd happy to do it because it's just a fun weekend. Seeing new people, and like, there's absolutely a thrill going to somewhere where you've never played before, and then someone afterwards just like, what the hell was that? I had no idea this sort of thing existed. Like, that's super rewarding and what I want.
Well, I won't keep you guys too much longer because I don't want to hold you up from going to see your gig, Wayne. So I guess if we can just quickly talk about the bands who are killing it at the moment, I guess. Local bands that you think, you know, this podcast is going to go out to an international audience. Who should people in, you know, the States be listening to? You know, a local band from Melbourne who might blow their mind.
Well, like in the genres, there's lots. Like I'm going to say, and I'm not just sucking up because he's on this page, but Religious Observance are killing it live at the moment, and their shows, it's definitely, if you're in Melbourne, you should go and see them. If you like heavy music, you should go and see this band. They're interesting, and Wayne is quite full on stage. Excellent to see live. Really good band. And also all those, but while we're at it, also all the death metal bands that I mentioned, like Hormagaunt, Gutless, Munt as well, good. You know, Carcinoid, great. Faceless Burial, 100 Years War. There's a whole lot. There's so many that I just keep forgetting. But there's also bands like Killat and stuff like that are playing different types of music, different styles that are unusual. You know, it's just hard to put it down to one or two bands. There's just so much going on. And even in the black metal scene, there's some bands as well, like Anazrael and Cold of the Night and stuff like that are just doing wonderful things. It's cool when there's a lot of old guys still from the old scenes coming out, like Remains and, you know, Black Jesus pulling on their boots every so often. And it's just so much happening in Melbourne. It's just, the scene as a whole, it's just a really interesting scene. I think if you're really into heavy music, like a Melbourne holiday, the sort of right time of year would be the way to go. Just go and see just a whole lot of bands here. It's just the way to go. But get on Bandcamp and just search up Aussie extreme metal, because there's just so much of it, so much just good material. I get sent so much music. But over the last couple of years, the majority of the best stuff has been the local stuff. It's just been so good. Like Reaper, a good example. So good. You know, Melbourne band just killing it. And, you know, Iron Hawk from Tassie. And then, you know, if you want a bigger sort of band like Werewolves or, it's just too many. Let's keep going on and on.
What about you, Wayne?
Yeah, it's a bit that way. I could go on for ages, but outside of stuff that it's already been suggested, I think like the band I saw most last year was Churf, and I think particularly in a live setting, it's pure energy, it's fun, and like I got to play a few shows with them as well, and they're just like, they're good people that I just want to be around. They don't take themselves too seriously. And I guess musically there's that, like, you know, there's a lot of grind in it, but there's also that bit of a sludge element as well, bit of power violence, and it just, yeah, like, you know, looking back over it, there's a reason I saw them so many times. It's just fun. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of great bands. Dead, who I'm going to be seeing in like an hour or so, I can never rate them highly enough. They've recently started being a three-piece, not all the time, but sometimes, quite an atypical lineup with drums, bass, and bass. So, you know, you can only imagine how heavy that is. And it's just, yeah, I feel like they're completely underappreciated. It's also very, like, it's very strange music. So I totally get why some people doesn't quite land. But, yeah, I can't rate them high enough.
There's no one else that hits the drums as hard as Gem.
Well, exactly.
So hard.
Yeah.
They're definitely a favourite at Cave Dweller, that's for sure. I'd have to say they're probably at the moment my favourite Australian band.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Doubled Over's another one, which I think they're like, I mean, they played a last show like 5 years ago. They played what was going to be a last show on New Year's Eve, and it's just some of the heaviest sludgy grind you'll ever hear in your life. But apparently they're still going to do stuff, which I'm all on board with. But yeah, it's just like, and there's this bass tone that is absolutely mental. Like it's got to be seen. There's a new band, Slime City, that I'm really keen to see. Members of Doubled Over, so potentially in that same sort of realm as well. I'm really drawing a blank here, and it's really annoying me because there's so many great bands to see.
I've got a couple to chuck in that I thought of while you were talking, so if you don't mind, I'll
go for it.
Eternal Rot, like crazy band, such a good band. Cunt Squad, they're coming up. They've got some really cool releases coming out now, sort of like a metal punk thing happening, which is excellent. And Eschaton, if you like things a lot heavier, are a kind of blackened death metal band that are just they sort out the hate to use a cliche, they sort out the men from the boys when they play. A lot of people were like, oh, that's a lot heavy for me. They're a good band. So, and Alters from South Australia, so good. Talking about them last night, they're so good. And there's a lot, as Wayne was saying.
I'll jump in because I've remembered a couple more as well. And at one point in time, I lived in Frankston, so I'll call myself an honorary local, but there's two heavy bands from Frankston that just constantly nailing it. And like, we're talking how good the live scene is in Melbourne. It is good, but I think as far as like it's having its own scene, Frankston is on top. There's all these people that they're like, I've been to a lot of shows there at Singing Bird Studios particularly, and there's a lot of regulars, and they're all just like good people having a good time. They're considerate. It's just good to be around. But they also make that hour trek into the city to come and see bands, to come to Collingwood to see bands. So Nembutolic and Goat Shaman, can't rate them both highly enough.
Awesome.
Yeah, they're both very excellent. They're great choices. That the album from last year, Along the Frankston Line, Wayne actually put me onto that. I've been playing that a lot. That's such a good band. Such a good band.
Yeah. It's awesome now to see international bands now getting down and playing shows at Singing Bird in Frankston, which is awesome. You know, it's one of those places that could very, very easily get overlooked for reasonable reasons too, Frankston. But it's I know I lived down there a few years ago, and absolutely loved what was happening down there. So it's good to see that continuing.
Yeah, and like I'll talk anyone's ear off about Singing Bird. I can't rate the place highly enough. The guy that runs it, Stu, is just an all-round good bloke. He's been in the scene for years, but it's just so wholesome as well. Like, he runs rehearsal studios out of there as well, and he's just constantly supporting the younger local in particular. But like, he's just I can't rate the guy enough. And his venue, like, he's just pushing these big things and like getting those internationals to come, which is awesome. But like, do yourself a favor, go to Singing Bird at any time. I've been to a lot of shows there, and they're always just amazing.
Awesome. Well, any final thoughts or anything you guys would like to add? Feel free to plug your shows, plug your bands, tell us where we can find your stuff.
10 p.m. on a Tuesday night, Burning Bitumen on PBS, but also available at any time if you go to Radio On Demand, or if you're international, go to the PBS app. It is really good app, and you can listen back to all the shows as well as what's happening at the time. So it's a really good way to listen back to the shows. Pretty easy, and you can go and listen to shows that I've done at least for the last 6 months. So that's kind of cool, and easy to do it, and also makes it good that international people can listen in, and we do get support from all over the world. So it's good, because I think what we have in Melbourne is unique, and the support of heavy music is unique in the world, and we sort of forget that.
The PBS page is really good with its track listings and links and everything like that as well. So it's definitely worth something for people to jump on and check out if they're looking to find some of these bands we've been talking about. And what about you, Wayne? Plug your bands. Go for it.
Cool. So Religious Observance playing a show on the 16th of Feb at my spiritual home of Last Chance. With a band from New Caledonia called Burst, like a gore grind type thing. Piss Bolt, who Kenny's very familiar with. And then Rat Lord, which is a new project. And Festering Genital Orifice, which is a nice filthy noise project that I had the pleasure of doing a live to air set on my radio show this very week, in fact.
Awesome.
Get on with that. If that's something that interests you, it's called Casey Radio. So it's out in the southeastern suburbs. 9 o'clock on a Monday night, 9 till 10. And yeah, you can listen online live, but also there's the last probably 4 or 6 weeks of shows you can listen back on demand as well.
And if anyone wants to check out any of Wayne's amazing bands, just look up Creep Diet, Colostomy Baguette, and especially Religious Observance on Bandcamp. Get on there, buy the stuff. You won't be disappointed. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me, guys. I know you're busy and you're off to another gig as usual, Wayne. Well, thank you so much for joining us, guys. I'll let you get back to it. And, yeah, catch you soon at a show, hopefully.